Welcome back, spirits and souls. Don't mind the melting walls. They'll be back to normal in a moment. I'm more worried about the barbershop quartet that is dancing about my cellar. I managed to get the group down to a solo act, but all my weapons had broken, and I was forced to use the strategic retreat strategy. I tried to switch to my axe, but the reduced reach made it impossible to land a hit. Injured and unarmed, I retreated to craft a new spear. Thankfully, I also had a few bandages, and soon I was healthy enough to deal the final blow. They didn't have much more than lint in their pockets, so I can't even say it was worth it. Bloody but victorious, I emerged from the cellar to find it was raining, which was fine, better than snow at least. In fact, I was starting to suspect it would never snow in this area. A shame, really. I actually enjoy the snow. I headed back to my treehouse and quickly scarfed down the food I had prepared last time, and then gathered the pelts from the floor to store with the rest of the cured hides. In the meanwhile, I needed more spears and a good night's sleep. Unfortunately, I slept far too early, and it was still dark when I woke. While I waited for sunrise, I inspected my wardrobe and noted that my new clothes were starting to get worn out, and my old clothes barely qualified as rags. My options to replace them were limited, but it would have to be done nonetheless. I munched on some breakfast and stepped outside to be met with the first flurries of snow. I could still hear the rain, but this meant winter was close. I still wasn't sure how cold it would get, but it couldn't hurt to have warmer attire. I gathered the pelts I had collected in the clay vessel and got to work making fur gloves, boots, and a coat. I also examined the armor options in the handbook. I doubted I would need them for everyday use, especially since the heavy gear would only slow me down. But they would likely be useful when it came time to explore the deep caves and the secrets of this world. I also considered making a bow. I had never used one before, at least not in this game, and it would still be some time before I had enough pigs to provide all my meat-eating needs. Perhaps a new form of hunting would be the solution, or at the very least, a source of entertainment. I could set up a shooting range with various targets for practice and challenge myself with various obstacles. But before all of that, I had machinery I wished to build, and my chickens have escaped. I must have left the gate open. I don't remember leaving it open, but no one else could have done it. I grabbed some fences to block off escape routes and quickly found the runaways in the orchard. The most important one to catch was the rooster, who was far too interested in the bees. I finally got him to move and blocked his escape before circling around to spook him and the others into the pen. There was still one chick running free, but I had what I needed. If that chick wanted to risk foxes, then so be it. Not that I had seen any foxes in the area. I gave the escapees more food and then fed the goats before noting that the female had another kid on the way. If it was a girl, I'd be able to start the next generation sooner than expected. I checked my bees and got ready for a mass deforestation project. I originally had 2 goals for this project: clear away all the trees around the water sources, which could potentially be used for water wheels, and collect as many pine cones as possible so I can plant a forest that will hopefully provide me with lots of resin in the future. Unfortunately, I have been informed that the player-planted trees do not produce resin, so the second plan is dead in the water. I also don't actually know if any of the water nearby is the kind for water wheels. In any case, I will still be committing acts of mass deforestation since I need lots of wood for other reasons. And since I am chopping down so many trees, I will also be recreating my massive charcoal pit from my last world, but with a bit more creative flair. Last time, it was just a hole covered with dirt and very square. I don't know if a domed-shaped fire pit will work, but I am going to find out. Before I do any of that, I need to make lots of axes. I could use some of the bronze, but I don't want to waste what little I have when flint will do just fine. I took a brief detour to harvest some crops. I had quite a bit at this point, enough that I was going to need to consider alternative storage options. I also needed to consider the ideal temperatures for planting certain crops. As tempting as it was to plant every seed I had, I knew there was no point in doing so. I didn't need all the food types, and frankly, I didn't want them. Have you had turnips? They're gross. No one should be eating those. The only crop I need more of is the flax, and that is because I need materials for clothing and windmills. As I headed out to feed the animals, I spotted the escaped chick and noted that it had returned to its parents. Perhaps there was a way to catch it after all. I chased it for a moment before deciding I had better things to do. Mainly feeding all the animals and checking on the hides which had been soaking in the lime water. I quickly scraped them with my knife before setting them to soak in the weak tannin. It wouldn't be long before I finally had leather. I grabbed some oak so I could make more weak tannin and turn one weak tannin barrel into a strong tannin barrel. I don't know how much I would ultimately need, but it didn't hurt to be prepared. At this point, I had failed to chop down a single tree as originally planned. Instead, I made a path block to fill that one gap that had been bothering me for a while now. I also decided I didn't like the stairs I had originally used, so I replaced them with the path stairs instead. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with them. It's just that the path blocks are 1 pixel shorter than other blocks, which looked weird next to the normal height stairs. Although at this point it had gotten dark and I couldn't even see whether or not the path stairs looked better. I slept through the night, got shot at shortly after waking, and waited for the sun while exploring other clothing options. To my great disappointment, most of the good clothes required the clothier trait, which, as a clockmaker, I did not have. I would have to buy outfits from one of the traders if I wanted anything better than plain cloth and leather garments. Over the swamp and past the pit to my cellar I did go. There I once again noted the fullness of my clay vessels, especially the one where I had been storing grain. The mushroom vessel was rather empty, but the vegetable vessel was also getting quite full. Before I addressed that issue, I needed food, so I grabbed some eggs and onions and started a pot of omelet. I gathered more crops while it cooked, which made it rather difficult to ignore my growing storage problem, though I did try my best. I once again fed my animals and set out to begin the deforestation project, which I had temporarily forgotten about. As it turns out, chopping down a whole forest is very time-consuming. I spent more time clearing branches than chopping trunks. It would have been faster if I had brought the shears, but I forgot I had made them. I found a cave with quartz, which would have been considerably more useful a couple episodes ago when I was trying to make windows. But, oh well. In the meanwhile, I filled my pockets to the brim while ignoring the growing darkness. On returning to base, I was once again reminded that I did not have enough storage. It seemed I could not ignore this issue any longer. So, I ignored the issue a bit longer by napping more axes. I then drank from my milk bucket, considered going to bed, and instead made a bunch of rammed earth for use in the charcoal pit dome, which had to wait until I got a good night's rest. I once again began my morning with fighting a bowtorn, before carefully examining the growing chickens in case one of them was preparing to become a rooster. So far, it was only pullets. I scouted out the area for the coal pit, then grabbed my scythe and began clearing the land. I then flattened the area by clearing away unwanted dirt before digging one block down in a somewhat circular shape. My shovel then broke, so I needed to make a new one before I could continue. I spotted the loose pullet and attempted to chase it into the pen, only to have one of the other pullets run out. This time I put up fences and nearly managed to recapture one of them, only for it to dart past me and escape again. By now, I was committed. I grabbed more fences and circled round, backtracked, moved the fences again, and finally had them caged in. Now I could herd them back into the pen. Both exhausted and elated, I made another shovel and returned to digging out the coal pit. I initially made it too big and had to fill in the sides, but as I started placing the rammed earth, I realized I actually did need those parts dug out. So I grabbed my shovel and dug them out all over again. From the inside, I went 3 blocks up before pulling in the roof by 1 block. Each layer after was pulled in 1 block in hopes it would result in a dome-like shape. I think it came out pretty well. At the very least, it looked better than a box. Unfortunately, the local drifter decided to be a nasty critic about the design. I would have robbed him, but he was already broke. In the meanwhile, I turned the excess wood in my pockets into firewood and started filling the pit. This would be a long and slow process. Since it was once again getting dark, I grabbed some food from the cellar and returned to my treehouse to start cooking more meals. I was already getting tired of vegetable stew and omelets. For my own sanity, I would need to go hunting soon. The next morning, I grabbed my axes and set out to continue chopping down trees. I kept an eye out for pine resin, but found a bear instead. Maybe I would have better luck in a different forest. Annoyingly, the next location I tried was full of steep hills and more bears. Thankfully, bears are thick with all the seas, which means a barrier with 1 block gaps is plenty of protection while hunting. Annoyingly, the bear kept losing interest the moment it lost sight of me, which made luring it to the safety zone a repetitive act of poking the beast and running away. I finally took it down and collected all the bits and pieces. By now it was getting dark, and I was forced to light my torch to find my way home. Naturally, this resulted in my running headlong into a second bear. I don't know why it didn't chase after me, and I wasn't going to stop and ask. Back at my base, I attempted to cut the bear hide into 2 parts, one head and one pelt. For some reason, it wasn't working no matter where I put the knife, so I just threw the whole thing into the lime water. Eventually, I would realize that the position of each item within the crafting table mattered considerably. Back at the house, I cooked the meat and laid down to sleep. By morning, it was only partially cooked, so I waited patiently for it to finish. On my way back to the hut, I collected some mushrooms and harvested my crops. Next, I fed the animals, again, and threw some oak into the weak tannin to make more strong tannin. This way, I would have 2 barrels for each stage of the process. I made even more axe heads and chopped more firewood for the pit. So many stacks, and yet they filled only a small portion of the space. At least, when it is finally full, I will have more coal than I'll know what to do with. In the meanwhile, I headed back to the hills to try and find resin. I found a few pine trees, but almost no resin. Navigating the hills became so difficult, I eventually made ladders to help me get up and down each rise. While scurrying between cliffs, I found a rusty gear to add to my growing collection of loot. Soon it got dark, and once again I was forced to hurry home by torchlight. The next day, I opened my map and began examining the terrain. My map was color accurate, which meant if I could figure out which tree colors were the most likely to be pine, I could go to the location with the most pine trees. I started by examining the areas I had already explored. I had seen a few pine trees, if not many, and only one of them had any resin. I had marked it on my map and could see that the nearby tree was a dark green. If I looked for other similar green areas, perhaps I would find more pine trees. I had no desire to deal with more hills, but thankfully there were a few dark green patches to the north. If these really were pine trees, I would finally find more resin. I headed out into the rain and started north, pausing just long enough to mark a pit trap I had made back when I first started my base. Sure enough, the north was full of pine trees. It was also full of a limestone wasteland. The high winds blew large clouds of dust, which obstructed my vision. It was only slightly better once I entered the forest. Against one lone tree, I found a single axe. According to my map, I had once found surface copper in this area. The axe was likely something I had left behind when my pockets were full. Returning to the task at hand, I quickly found the resin I so dearly desired. With so many pine trees in one area, it wasn't hard to collect a large amount of the resource. Initially, I marked every find on the map, but this was probably unnecessary, since the amount of resin here was so plentiful. I also found many blueberry bushes, which I happily collected for my fields. Eventually, the sky turned red, as the sun began to set. As I headed home, the red sky turned gray from rain and then darkened completely as night fell. Once again, I relied on my torch to get me through the dark, right up until I made the mistake of tripping into water. My vision went black as my torch was extinguished. I had no way of relighting it, and had I been further on land, I would have run the risk of falling into a hole or running into a bear or drifter. Thankfully, my map showed I was on the edge of the swamp where my home was built. So long as I followed the map and kept my head above water, I would soon see light once more. I had a little trouble relighting my torch, as the torch holder insisted on making me remove the torch from its grasp instead of simply letting me light the thing. Frustrated, I went to bed. In the morning, I gobbled down some breakfast before planting the new berry bushes in the field. Next, I relit all my torches before checking on the hide in the lime water barrel. The singular bear skin scraped into 2 hides, which I tossed in the weak tannin. Down in the cellar, nearly all my berries had rotted, which was fine. I needed the rot for compost anyway. I decided to make an extra compost barrel, and then checked on my chickens. The new generation was all grown, so I collected the eggs and retired the old hen. For good measure, and to ensure I didn't get too many eggs, I also retired 2 of the younger hens. Neither the goats nor the pigs had any new babies, so I harvested my crops. I still wasn't sure what winter would be like in this climate, so I opted not to plant anything new. In the meanwhile, I made some lovely chicken stew. I then decided to clear more of the land, partly because I wanted more space in case I needed a new building, and partly because I needed a ludicrous amount of wood if I wanted to fill the coal dome. By some luck, I managed to find a patch of high fertility soil, which I quickly collected. Once it got dark, I once again returned home. Against my better judgment, I made some turnip stew and went to bed. I am very glad I cannot actually taste it. I noticed the cattails had grown back, so I grabbed my scythe and chopped them down. I needed a steady supply of this plant in order to keep up with the bees. I once again harvested the honey, careful to make sure I left a couple full hives to repopulate the new skeps. Back at the hut, my full pockets reminded me that I needed more storage and had been stubbornly ignoring it for much too long. I finally made a couple of crates, killed a shiver in the cellar, and started reorganizing the food storage, beginning with the grain. I broke the vessel, spilling grain all over the floor, and put down the first crate. I had to sift through the mess to find the amaranth, which I put in the first crate, since it was one of the grains I had the most of. I put the storage vessel by the pillar and put the other grain in there. I then placed the second crate and filled it with sunflower grain, since it was the other one I had the most of. I then fed all my animals, checked my leather production, put away the extra grain, and finally squeezed the honey from the honeycomb. Once the barrel is full to the brim, I plan to turn all that honey into mead. I do wish the game would alter the recipe a bit. In real life, mead begins with a mix of honey and water, not pure honey. I'm not sure how the mechanics would work. but at least it would be closer to real mead production. Also, I don't think I need this much wax. Not unless I plan to make an absurd number of candles. In the meanwhile, I need more bronze tools and ingots. Well, I suppose need is inaccurate. More like it would be convenient to have more ready and waiting. I decided I would at least start with some tools I didn't have yet. Mainly a bronze hoe, a Phelps blade, and an axe. The rest I turned into ingots. By the next morning, the hot metal had cooled, and I had 2 shiny new tools and 1 new weapon ready to go. I then started another crucible of bronze, heated 2 ingots in the forge, and carefully put the clay molds back on the shelf. I decided to make 1 new scythe for every nickel in that meme, and then poured out an extra axe and 4 ingots. The last thing I decided to do was replace some of the farmland with the high fertility soil I had found. Unfortunately, part of the ground gave way, and I lost 1 block of the good stuff to the watery depths. I grabbed some packed dirt to keep it from happening again, and then proceeded to lay the new ground. All this farm work made me realize that there was not going to be an icy cold winter in this area. It was already February, and not a single patch of snow had formed, and the only snow I saw was at night. The weather would only get warmer from here, so there was no point in continuing to wear the winter clothes. As for the farm, there were still a couple patches of crops. I left those as they were and saved some of the good dirt to replace them later. I tested the new Phelps blade on a drifter in my hut before breaking my stone hoe on the new dirt. It was a good thing I had just made a shiny bronze hoe to replace it. I then Phelpsed another drifter before collecting the bronze ingots and axe from the molds. I neatly put away my hammer and increased the stack of bronze ingots. I spent a brief moment removing unwanted foliage from the orchard, which reminded me of a particular device I wanted to build. I just needed the bronze rod I had crafted ages ago, the resin I had collected this episode, a bit of animal fat from I don't remember where, some planks, and my hammer. All together, it made a fruit press. I placed the device next to the honey barrel and decided to call it a day. Thank you for watching, everyone, and remember, take care of yourself.